of the county. This is a roundtable sharing of experiences gone by. The National Archives in Washington, D.C. contains all the history of our country for the use of its citizens. Its slogan is, "All the past is a prologue." In other words, how can you tell where you are going if you don't know where you've been? In the next few minutes, let your mind walk with us down the long road of memory. Seated at our round table, and I must say this is the closest we could come to a round table, on my right is Fern Parsons, who is the town historian of the town of Valney. Fern lives in Mount Pleasant. On my left is Ken Sweet of Phoenix. Ken is co-owner of Sweet Woods Memorials in Phoenix. On my far left is Bruce Phelps of Fulton. He is the owner of Fulton Tool Company at that city. As we start our round table, I will call on each of you in turn, going counterclockwise. Please hold your memories to a 2-minute maximum, if possible, when your turn comes. Starting with Fern, it is most appropriate that she open the memory box on our first item to be talked about, the general store. Fern, you told me that you are now living in the old general store building at Mount Pleasant, and that you and your husband ran it for 10 years. Could you tell us about that?
Well, we did. We bought that store from Claude and Clarissa Ballard. Clarissa had died, and Claude was in his 80s and not able to run it. And we ran it for 10 years. We closed it in '77. But it had a history of George Bellinger. I guess actually it originated at there was an original store there, and I don't know just where that was located. Way back, Joshua Derby in 1869 started a store. And Joel Wright took it over in 1870 and closed it in the spring of 1877. But then, coming up a little bit in years, Eugene Bartlett started a store in his home, which is down the first place on the left as you start down the Patty Lake Road from Mount Pleasant Road. And he soon decided that it would be easier to have it up at the corners, which originally was Hubbard's Corners. They call it Mount Pleasant now. And he built a building on some leased land. He leased the land from Vance, and he ran it. George, his son, ran it, and then George Peckham bought it. And then George Peckham bought land right across the road, and the store is where it is now with an addition. It was just the upright part of it that was there. But I had the usual country store with the wires running, you know, and the gloves and the cartons of this and penny candy. My husband used to threaten to throw a blanket over it if I didn't stay there and run it. He said it took a half an hour for a child to spend a nickel, so he thought that was a waste of time. But that was part of the joy of the store for me, was the children that come in. I've had a lot of them tell me since that they teased their mother for years after I closed it in '77. Well, I know she wants to see me anyway. It's just nice, a country store like
Right,
that.
right. Would you like to add something about general stores? As I understand it, you were brought up in Canada.
Yes, I was brought up in a merchant's family. My father was in the hardware business, and he sold goods to the farmers. And much of that was done by barter. We, in the spring, after school, I used to have to pack maple syrup. You know, an imperial gallon of maple syrup is 13 pounds, 2 ounces. And I had to weigh every can. But it was a lot of fun. I remember that. It was great education. Certainly running a general store is a great education for any business person. You learn rapid calculation. You know how to treat people and how to deal with them. And I think the store Fern ran, and I used to go out there once in a while, was just a lovely store, and it's too bad those stores aren't going now. What a tourist attraction.
Ken, would you like to add anything on general stores?
Well, I've been one of Fern's customers on numerous occasions.
There you are.
When we would
Small world, isn't it?
finish working in Mount Pleasant Cemetery, we'd stop in for something at the store. It was the only place around, and maybe then off to Peck Cemetery or down to Oswego, but we'd stop at the store. The country stores and small stores have always been an interest of mine. Phoenix, New York, of course, 1916, they had the Phoenix Fire, and the entire business district was burned to the ground. And they started a whole cottage industry. Everybody that had a spare room or a large porch turned it into a small store because for several weeks, a month or so, the fire was in September, there was no place to buy groceries for the people in Phoenix. And they had this little store sprung up, and they continued through the Depression, and they were still going when I went to school. It was, you could go to Morgan's store, you could go to Mohat store, Mullen's store, where the kids knew all, and who had the best penny candy, the biggest variety.
Quite
and
an
so
experience, right? I'm just going to change a little bit here because when I started this, I was going to go counterclockwise, but I have a subject for you, Bruce, if you don't mind. We'll
No,
catch you
that's
on the
fine,
next
that's
round.
fine.
Okay. Bruce lives on Pathfinder Point, and you told me some time ago that you dug up some fortifications or something there. Was it you that told me that?
Yes.
Could you tell us also just briefly about Pathfinder Island? And then you can pick this up, or Ken will pick this up when we're right around again.
Well, I viewed the digging of what looked like a works of some kind that viewed the river to the north. But starting with Pathfinder Island, which may be very important in the Oswego River, and Pathfinder Island was certainly a spot that the early explorers saw, that the Indians saw, and on up at Indian Point where the Indians used to camp and where the French camped. And if you'll recall, Bill Perkins with Cornell University did a dig there and proved that there was traveling on that river 2,000 years before Christ.
Could we just interrupt a minute to kind of orient this? So we're orient this from the sewage plant. Most people know where the sewage plant, and you're...
Yes, okay, well, Pathfinder Point is where the Fulton sewage plant is now. I guess that comes back to the island and where Pathfinder Road on the west side runs down past my house to where Roger Thaser lived, right on the point. And there was a dock where you could take a boat over to Pathfinder Island. On Pathfinder Island was a men's club, I believe. I haven't been able to find anybody to dispute that. And on the other side, coming across from Babcock's gas station, was a rope-pulled ferry. And I have a photograph of that ferry coming across on Ladies' Day with ladies sitting in chairs on that ferry. Pathfinder Island was had a clubhouse. They played ball. There are lots of pictures of ball games going on there, and pictures of scouts, I would think, and that kind of thing. Mr. Morrow seemed to be a scoutmaster and had a group of boys. Now, coming up Pathfinder Point Road that John and I had talked about, where they dug the foundation for a new home there, they ran into what looked to me like a fortification. It overlooked the river and kind of like, I guess they would call it a breastworks. But it was laid up stone with no mortar, and probably was at one time a lookout of some kind, because that's up above the river probably 25 or 30 feet. And you could see all the way down to where probably they would make the bend coming out of where Armstrong is now and down through that area. Pathfinder Point Road is a byway. It has to be maintained by those who live on it, and that seems to be me. And a few people that have homes down there have the right to use it.
Did you want to add anything to that, Ken?
No,
All
only
right,
that I
not you
used
hold
to.
right there. Would
I
you
used
like
to
to add
spend
anything to
Sunday
that?
afternoons.
I didn't realize that it was a men's club, but I guess I should have because of the time and era that it was. I have seen pictures where there were children and ladies there, so it must have been a ladies' day.
Okay. Now, Ken, I'm going to ask you something. Ken lives just south of Flinks, 1361, is that right? Main Street?
Well, that's not where I live.
All
That's
right,
where I
well, all
reside
right,
most of
well,
the time.
That's
but-
where you do your business at.
Yeah.
And right opposite there, as I understand it, is what they call in the Oswego River is Treasure Island.
Right.
Could you tell us a little about that?
Well, Treasure Island is,
Tell us how it got the name Treasure Island.
well, there is a 1930s Education Department cast iron information plaque on Route 57 that denotes Treasure Island. And the legend on that plaque states that the Jesuits from Liverpool, the French fort, were forced to leave because of hostile actions, or they thought there were hostile actions coming from the Indians, and they pulled out in the darkness and hastily threw together their belongings and headed down the river. And when they got to Phoenix, they were having difficulty traveling in the canoes with all of the bulk that they had. According to that plaque, it says a small cannon. Well, it's hard to believe unless they had a military contingent at the French fort that they would have a cannon. But this was something that they had to stash along the riverbank somewhere, so they decided to leave it on the island. And they also had said they left gold. That's another, the only gold that I would think they might have would be religious items, a cross, chalice, something of that nature, but because maybe they didn't want to risk losing it, so they said they buried it in the soft sand on the shore of the island.
So it's been known as Treasure Island
And
ever since?
that's why it's become known as Treasure Island for years. People dug over there. It's been owned by 4 people, different families that I know of. The first that I know was Baldwin family. It was called Baldwin's Island. I think if you look at some of the old maps, it listed as Baldwin's Island. And then Stoll, who was a big farmer, he bought the island and he used it to keep sheep on. It had no vegetation other than grass and a few trees, but he had a flatboat that he pulled over with a rope, like Bruce said, one of these rope ferries. He'd take his herd of sheep over and turn them loose, and they could just forage over there. The dogs wouldn't bother them, so forth. And after Stoll, my grandfather, Tad Sweet, he upgraded his family farm on Main Street in Phoenix, and he wanted to have a formal garden and a sun porch on the back of the house, and he didn't want to look out on the island the way it was. There were several old canal barges pulled up and tied to the shoreline and left to rot.
One of those was one of Bowman's.
Yeah, it was
right. Remember the
Homer
name of it?
Bowman's
Yeah.
father.
Yes, right. What was his name? Bob Bowman's father.
Homer.
Homer Bowman, yes. I talked with him many times.
Yeah, he had
Wealth of
he
information.
related taking trips all the way to New York on that and across Long Island Sound in it.
Quite a thing.
But my grandfather got the island, and then he planted it to evergreens, and he wanted to screen himself off from the canal traffic. And so that's basically,
Basically, it's the story of Treasure Island.
that's the story of
Okay.
Treasure Island.
Oh, we'll go on now to Fern. And Fern, where'd you go to school? You
At
showed me
Hubbard-
a picture there,
Hubbard
right?
Schoolhouse, right?
Right.
I have that down here. That was built in 1817, and the first teacher there was, I have to look at my note, Miss Elizabeth Richmond. There was also, she married a Thomas. And when I went there, started school going to Ruth Streeter Bartlett. And then Liza Fenter, she was Eliza Hubbard. She was our teacher. And that was I had just those two teachers, and I went through 7th grade there. And then I came into Fairgrave and took 8th grade. The best thing I think about those country schools, I don't know of a schoolhouse around now that you can sit there in the wintertime and smell potatoes baking. We had
That's quite an experience.
the wood stove that we had. Up on the oven, there was this round cylinder oven that was part of the stovepipe
Stove,
somehow. And I just remember we brought our baked potatoes and we carved our initials in them so that you got the right
So you
potato
got your
bag.
right potato.
Right. Well, somebody else might have brought a small scrubby one. You didn't want to
Yeah,
end
you
up
wanted
with
to
that.
get the right potato,
That's
right?
right. And another thing, you didn't have to do a lot of going back, because if you were observant at all, you had the classes below you kind of touching on their lessons of the day, and that might just hit a spot that you hadn't got to clear when you did it. And you also were ahead of the game because you could hear the people ahead of you reciting, so you were
Those school
You
days
really-
are really something, right?
Yes,
And-
we had a great time. We
Yeah.
had I remember Ruth Streeter Bartlett had this wonderful chest that she kept there. And when it got towards a holiday time, she played the piano, and we had triangles and cymbals and all kinds of
Really
little
good.
hand instruments that we had ourselves quite a musical.
Great experience. I had an aunt that taught way up north of Glens Falls, and one of the tricks, the first day they taught school, was the kids went up and stuck a blanket down the chimney when it's cold. School was dismissed for the rest until she got on to where all that smoke was coming.
The
Well,
only other thing that's
that-
worse is having somebody that traps go and get a skunk out
Oh,
of their
yes,
trap before
yeah,
they come
yeah,
to
yeah.
school.
I know Bruce went to a different school. You tell us a little of that?
Yes, I went to, in our village, we had two schools, and one for the lower grades, and one, that was the white school, and the red school was one for the larger grades. And then after 8th grade, we either took a bus or a train and went to high school. Going to the lower grades, as Fern talked about, you listened to the upper grades as they were being taught, and by the time you got there, you knew pretty well what was going on. And I think of some of the tricks. We had to take turns firing the stove, and the kids that had the job ahead of me put 22 shells in the stove, and they
We are learning
they
things
made
here.
small noises. So when it came my turn, I put a shotgun shell in, and it blew down the stovepipe. So there were a lot of tricks going
Yeah.
on.
Kaz, you have some stories probably. Where did
Well,
you go to school?
I went to school in the Phoenix High School,
Oh,
from kindergarten to graduation, all in one building. But the country school, the Phoenix, it was before centralized school district, and we had our series of country schools in the town of Skrupel. And I can remember Roy Spencer, Dr. Roy Spencer, who lived on the United River Road. He claimed that his whole start in life and leading him into higher education was from the country school. And as Fern said, and as Bruce said, listening to the classes below and above you was a big help. And he was evidently of such an intellect that they had an encyclopedia that somebody had furnished for the school. And he would take those books home as just a toddler, I mean, a young child. And he read the whole encyclopedia. And he knew so many things
wow.
that he later went on to be a professor at MIT.
Huh.
And he said that he wanted to donate money to have that Seaford School completely rebuilt and manned so that students of today could spend a week in the country
You
school.
tell them where that Sebring School is, that's out near Center Road, right?
Yeah, they moved it from
Yeah.
one side of the road to the other.
I didn't know that, yeah. I
Somebody
remember the
was-
Hubbard boys telling me about the potatoes up on the stove there, Larry Hubbard and Ken,
Yeah,
yeah, they went to Sebring School.
but that's,
Yeah.
he said is the best education came from the country school,
Oh,
and he
yeah.
said you couldn't beat it.
Yeah, right.
And
Well, let's go on to a little different subject. Fern, when did you first learn to drive a car? It's a good one, always good.
Hi.
This one.
I really don't remember the first time I drove a car. I do, because I lived on a farm, I remember the first time my aunt let me try to drive the tractor. And I was so used to a bicycle that I almost put us in the ditch, but if it started to the right, I thought I needed to turn to the right like you do with a
Where'd you learn to
bicycle.
shift? Where'd you learn to shift?
Oh,
You didn't
that
learn on
was-
a Model T, did you, by any
No.
chance? No, all right.
No, my husband has a Model T,
Yeah.
23, but I've only driven that once. I figured if I put a scratch on that, I might as well leave the country. So- But I learned to drive with my uncle's truck. Sometimes we did things with that. Mostly, like when we're putting hay in, I drove a team of horses or to pull the fork up into the top of the barn. But usually I ended up in the hay mow, mowing it away because my brother had asthma and hay fever and couldn't do it. But I think it was Uncle Irvin's truck that I
You
really
might
learned
explain,
how
while
to
you're on the
shoot
subject of the hay mow and the hay fork, might explain how this got up there.
Well, there was a track in the center of peak of the barn, and there was always a little thing that came out from the side of the barn like this, and the track came out into that little hood that was off the end of the barn, and you drive the load of hay under that, and then this fork would be down, and you'd push it down into the hay and make sure it was way down in, and then somebody else over out of another opening on the barn drove a team or a tractor or something and pulled that up, and it clicked in up in that little hood that stuck out, and then you pulled it until it was,
Went all the way
somebody in the
down,
mow
yeah.
said it's where they wanted it, and then there was a trip rope, and it tripped the hay down, and then we mowed it back to the sides of the barn.
I had to ask you that while you were right on the subject. Did you want to tell us about where you learned to drive?
Yes, I think I learned to drive in a Rio Speedwagon truck that had chain drive. And I don't believe the gears were the same. I know they weren't the same as a standard shift in a Model A Ford, as an example. But I did learn to drive that truck first, and then my father never owned a car. He owned trucks because they made money. But a car he could rent when he needed one and rent a driver with it. But when people would come to visit, very often I would get in their car, and if they left the keys in it, I'd take it for a ride. So that's where I learned to drive. Probably at 7, 8 years old.
Oh, my gosh, is that right? When did you learn, Ken?
well, as I'm younger than the other
Oh.
panelists here,
Other
I learned
older
to drive
folks, right?
on a Jeep.
Oh, boy.
And immediately after the war, as the soldiers came home, my next door neighbor, George Waters, up in Phoenix, came to town with his bride in a brand new civilian Jeep.
Oh, boy.
And it was tan with orange wheels, and it was, as youngsters,
Class.
we liked Jeeps anyway. And he said he dug his own foundation for his house just south of the village, kind of across from Sharon Chevrolet, actually. And I would go up, and he'd let me drive the Jeep. Of course, he could put it in low range, low gear, and there was nothing I could do to get in trouble. I just crawled around. And I can remember his wife trying to escape as I was heading straight toward her, and she was trying to get out of the way, afraid I'd run over her, I guess. But I learned to drive that, but only in the field. And And then after that, I graduated to doodlebugs. And
Tell us what a doodlebug is.
well, it was an automobile that was cut down, and then they'd take a Ford worm drive rear end and made it up to whatever front end they had, and that would give them the power, and they'd put the truck wheels on, a set of chains, and tractors were expensive, hard to come by, and they could pull a drag or pull a disc with that. And so that doodlebug that I learned on was a Hubbard machine from Phoenix.
Yeah.
And he worked a wartime job, and they had a carpool. And I can remember the car pulling in with no muffler every morning to pick up the neighbor. They worked up Brown Lake Chafin. And the car got so bad that they had to get another one. So the neighbor across the street got the car, and he cut it down to make a doodlebug. And I was given the whole body, which we had a scrap drive at the end of the war. And I won a medal with Eisenhower's likeness on it for turning in the largest amount of scrap steel.
Oh,
Everybody else was into cans and everything else, and I had the whole back end of a
okay, now,
Dodge car.
now we'll go, since you mentioned it, I'm glad just perfect timing, because we're going to talk about World War II. Next year, 1995, is the 50th anniversary of World War II. So Fern, you'll be first, and I'll ask you one question. Where were you on December 7th, 1941?
At home.
Would you tell us what happened?
Well,
It's something you'll never forget, I'm sure.
no, we just were there, and Dad had the radio on, and everybody just came to a halt in disbelief that
How old were you then? Well, you don't have to,
41, I would have been just 11 years old.
what did it mean at age 11? Is just a little bit more than you could comprehend, wasn't it, really? It was for me, I know.
It
I was
wasn't
much
that-
older than,
It was scary because occasionally we went to the movies, and that's the way you saw any kind of newsreel or anything at that time. And we had seen some newsreels of what was going on in Europe, and so that
in other words, it wasn't an entire novelty. You'd known
we had
somewhat,
seen a little
that
bit of
there was
that.
trouble,
But
that's right.
I know that from that time on, and once in a while, under a lot of stress, I still have what I call my only nightmare that I've ever had in my life. But I've had the same one repeatedly. And if anyone's ever been out where I grew up, where Claudia has her office, you're almost to 45.
County Route 45.
Yes,
That's right.
and as you look to the east, it goes up on a little hill, and that was where we always slid downhill and skied and everything. And once this war became so personal, because it became personal on December 7th, I started having nightmares, and I used to have them quite often, always the same one, and I got so I was afraid to go to sleep. I would see shell holes all over that corner area, and I would see us as a family dug back into that hill. And
So it left a very profound experience with you. So now, Bruce, where were you on December 7th, 1941?
Well, I remember hearing the news on radio, and we used to listen to, I was in Canada, and we did have a radio. But I think we had been to war in 1939, the Canadians, along with Britain, declared war against Germany, and later against Italy. And I believe we were probably acclimatized to war by that time, because one of the divisions that came out of Dunkirk were Canadians from
Took
our
a
part
beating,
of the country.
real
so,
beating, massacre.
yeah. So we had,
So it was a different
were-
experience than
it was a
people in
much
this
different,
country. You'd
yes.
already got preempted, right? Ken, how about you?
Well, same as Fern. I heard the announcement on the radio, and I had prior to the Pearl Harbor, they had a Bundles for Britain program. And my mother had a pony coat. It was a pony skin coat with very fine fur. And I believe she had it when she got married. And she donated that to the Battle of Britain, or Bundles for Britain.
yeah.
And I can remember it laying on the stairway in the back of the school. And I liked that coat because it was smooth. I can remember it from when I was crawling around the house. She always had that coat. And I hated to see it go. And I can remember running down in the school with some of my classmates and saying, "There's my mother's coat there." But
Where's my coat?
my father was in the paper business, and he, of course, they bought dyes for paper from Germany, and the dyes were being cut off. You couldn't get dye. And my grandmother wintered in Florida, and he thought, well, we'd better take one trip to Florida with the kids because it might not be possible again. So we spent Easter Sunday in '42 in West Palm Beach. And I can remember looking out of the hotel windows, and they were blacked out at night. And if we went someplace for dinner with the folks at night, you had to go through a vestibule that was dark and then into the bright lights when you came inside. But I remember watching out of the hotel, the Surfside Hotel, and watching a German submarine torpedo an oil tanker.
Really?
And it burned all night.
Oh, my goodness.
And I mean, this was quite an experience for
Oh, I would think
kids
so.
my age. And
Yes.
of course, I've been interested in submarines ever since. I mean, it was just-
You actually had that experience?
Yeah, and then we went to Miami Beach
Something.
because General Stoll, who was from Phoenix, he was in charge of the training command, and they had a whole hotel commandeered for the military right on Miami Beach. And my father wanted to go down and say hello to him, and he was busy at the time, but we went out on the beach and we could see the destroyers coming out past the breakwater, and every morning they had troops on the beaches because things floated ashore, and they weren't things necessarily you'd want the beach-going public to see at that time, and they'd drag all the stuff off the beaches and get rid of it if it
Oh,
was
Sure.
from salvage
Well,
from
I
ships.
think we'll do another section sometime on World War II, and it's, thank you for just a brief survey. Well, we must be getting 100 war stories, but I won't get
Doesn't
wild.
take long to get going, does it?
no.
Yeah. When you were young, how was your mail delivered, Fern?
And we had a mailman similar to what we have now. At one time, there was a post office at Mount Pleasant, in the old original store, the one that I really don't know too much about or where it exactly was, but we've always, as long as I can remember, it's been Fulton Post Office. And I would like to have more information. I'd like to find some artifacts about, with the Mount Pleasant
Postmark.
postmark or
Mhm.
something like that, but I haven't been that lucky. I've tried to watch.
I'll keep my eyes open if I find one. I might have an extra one, really.
Would you
I think so,
really?
yes.
Never come across it, but we had just the one mailman for years. The same one always came.
You're talking about mail in the general stores. When you had the general store, would you have a post office there?
No,
that
that
wasn't
was
until-
early, much earlier in the
Okay, okay.
1800s when that was
Because
at
I know
Mount Pleasant.
a lot of the general stores, they always,
I was
they
the
always
neigh-
say that the postmaster read all the mail.
I was the
In the
neighborhood
smaller
collector.
communities, right?
Especially
I would,
postcards.
I want to tell a story. I lived in Hartwick, New York for a few years, which is about 5 miles out of Cooperstown. I want to tell you this story about general stores before I forget it. We just had our first child, and my wife wasn't too prepared with the different routines. And of course, I think there's a routine you go through where you get baby oil and you oil the baby. You know. So she went into Orlo Birch, who ran the store there, and she says, Mr. Birch, she said, we're getting instructions for this baby oil, you know, and he's, as if to say, how often do you oil the baby, you know? She said something like, how often do you change the oil? He says, oh, about every 1,000 miles. I had to remember that. I had to tell you that. All right. It's your turn now, Bruce. You're going to talk about mail.
Well, we had a post office in the village, and the train came in 6 days a week, and it brought the mail. And in the winter, that was the only way you could get in or out of the village was on the train. They didn't plow the roads, but they brought logs into the mill, and they had bobsled roads and teams of horses. But we got the mail in the post office. It was good delivery, good service. And I think I can remember a 3-cent stamp for first-class mail.
Yeah, that was a lot of money. And I remember 2 cents for, of course, going back a couple of years.
1,
Ken?
2s, and 3s.
Yeah,
you know,
right, that sure
the
has
wartime
changed.
3-cent with the wings of the eagle going up.
I
in the
remember
shape
went
of
up to
a V.
3 cents, everybody had a fit, 1 cent. Why, is there, good Lord, everybody going bankrupt. Look at it now, 32 cents coming up. Your turn.
Our mail always came home by father, because he being in business, he went to the post office and picked up the mail, and then anything that was for the house, he brought it home. As a youngster, I was amazed that my aunt lived in Boston, and when we would write her a card, we had to put RFD down in the corner, which was Rural Free Delivery.
Right.
And I had to be told what that meant, to explain to me. And then there were star routes and things like this, which, where our mail came to the village post office, you know, it wasn't until a school field trip that we went to the post office to see mail sorted and things like that, that I knew anything about the postal delivery.
Which might, like magic, right? You put
Oh,
it in and
amazing,
it goes.
yeah.
Okay, we'll just move right along now. Do you remember the old soda fountain?
You mean up there,
The
my Loudon's?
drugstore? Oh, well, let's talk about my Loudon's. I live right where my Loudon's used to be.
Right.
Topaz
Foster
Towers now,
Brothers
yes.
and-
She was quite a, as I understand, quite a, tell us about my Loudon's. That was a, if I remember, my Loudon's was the gathering place for all the youngsters, is that
All the
right?
high school kids,
right?
yeah.
You tell us a little about that,
Well,
if you remember that.
I
Not too many
wasn't-
people know my Loudon's.
I wasn't as frequent a visitor there as the ones that lived in the city because I rode a school bus. But I did go once in a while when I was staying down. I used to stay sometimes with Tom Scott's daughter, Pat Scott, and I were in school together. So once in a while, we would go down after school if I was staying because of something that was going on at the high school. We were both in the band, involved with
What'd you play in the band?
cornet,
You did?
flat cornet.
Oh, okay.
So, and I lived next door to Ma Loudon's daughter,
You know how the-
Bruce Gibson.
Yeah, and that's
lives
where
next door.
that's where the word soda jerk came from, right?
Right.
Remember they used to, we used to love lemon Cokes. The Coke didn't taste right, you put a little bit of lemon in it, it was like high class. Your turn, Bruce.
Well, we had a soda fountain in the village, and as kids, I don't remember using it very much. We didn't have that kind of money, but once in a while, you'd be able to get in there and get a. I remember the cherry Cokes.
Oh, those were great.
Same thing,
yes.
yeah.
Real great.
I think that's ahead of mixed drinks. You probably got into something else now.
Might possibly be. Well, you do, you know, you age a little mellow, a little. Ken, you want to tell us?
I love the soda fountain. I mean, with a name like Sweet, it came naturally.
Oh, that's a good
In the
one.
30s, we had a candy maker named Floss Kinslow in Phoenix, and he had an ice cream store, and he had the ice cream tables that the antique dealers are after today with the coil spring back chairs, and we would go in there, and the thing that I remember the earliest was they served a scoop of ice cream in a little metal dish with a foot on it. And that dish was always so cold. And it made the ice cream seem colder because it was in a metal dish. But he made milkshakes. I was never allowed to have a milkshake because I couldn't handle one. My first milkshake I got for swimming 25 yards in water over my head when I was 5, and it was up in the Adirondacks, and the man said, if you swim that 25 yards, I'll buy you a milkshake. So unbeknownst to my father, I'd been drinking milkshakes before he bought me the first one. Then we had Keller's drugstore in Phoenix, and a lot of the kids wouldn't go over to Keller's because he had those cone-shaped scoops, and with a little crank on the top to dip it out. And we always figured that the dealer that had the round scoop, he gave him more ice cream, so
right.
we would go there. And there was another store that served ice cream, Fraser's Drugstore, and he hand-packed the ice cream in from bulk to a seal-like container.
Right.
And they'd always mound it up and then squeeze the top
Squeeze the
down
top
on.
down, right.
And it was unique when he went to the pre-packaged ice cream, that didn't seem to be quite as good. But the hangout in town, as I was a teenager, was Sherman's.
Sherman's.
Gid Sherman's. And we would go there and he'd make anything you want, black and white sundaes. And we used to drink a mixed drink. I drank a lime, root beer lime.
Oh, boy.
It was a hideous looking thing, but
High
it was
on the hog,
tasty.
right?
But we always figured you got more flavor if you mixed two instead of just one.
Okay, now I'm gonna go along, because you're talking about things right now that you go out and you pay $1, what do you pay, $1 something for a milkshake? And back then, and the kids, they got all kinds of money now. I never saw it. I don't think I ever had $5 in my life till I was, excuse me, years and years old. And they got, I don't know. So then we go around, and I heard the other day, I said, one of the kids, he said, of course, they're all wearing the baggy pants now. I haven't caught up on that yet. I said, what's the matter? What you doing today? He says, I'm bored. I said, oh, I've heard this before. We raised 6 kids, incidentally. And it says, let me ask you a question. And I think what the answer to being bored is that we never had time to get bored. My dad would always find something to do. What do you think about chores? Did you have chores to do when you were young? I know I'm going to get an answer on that one.
Yeah, just a few. I was the oldest of 4 children.
Oh, you lucky kid.
And so that meant anything that Mom needed help with, Fern was the first
You
word
just
you
happened to be
heard.
handy, just happened to be old enough.
But I was also a tomboy, and I would rather work all day and half the night with my father doing work outdoors than a half a day's work inside. And I did everything. I milked cows, and that was always a fear of mine when I went to Fulton schools, that they would find out why I couldn't stay after school. Not only I had to come home on the bus, it would have been difficult to get home otherwise, but I had to come home because during the war, my dad worked afternoons, and he worked for Remington Rand and Hunter Arms also, and he usually worked the afternoon shift. And so that meant that when I got off the school bus, I immediately changed my clothes, put on jeans, which certainly in those days was not the accepted.
Overalls.
And
They had a
boots,
different name for it.
and went and got the cows in and I cleaned the barn and milked the cows. And
But you never got bored.
I never had time to
Got
be
so
bored.
I
And
love
think
that, I'm
that's-
bored.
I
Nothing to
think
do-
that's
yeah.
what's wrong with most of the young people
Well,
that
that's
are in
it.
trouble
I'm
today.
sure of that. That's why I brought that up about being bored. See, they don't work.
You could always, during the summer, they tell about the kids a week out of school in the summertime, there's anything to do. They plant a garden, let the kids learn the
Sure.
difference between a weed and a
That's-
tomato plant and a hill of corn, and keep the weeds out of them, and after the tomato worms start coming, smash them and
Oh, I gotta tell you about you reminded me, I don't mind, I hope you don't mind if I can, I gotta tell you about this guaranteed potato bug killer. It was advertised in American Agriculturist for $1. Now, this is back during the Depression when $1 was really something. Would have used arsen and lead then to kill potato bugs, right? So it says send $1, that's all it says, guaranteed, money back, right? So what you got was 2 little pieces of 2x4 like this with instructions. Hold one block underneath the potato leaf with the bug on, take the other one and go like that. And they tried to sue him for fraud. They couldn't do it. They said, there's nothing wrong with that. There's an instructions, just what to do, guaranteed every time. Well, I couldn't resist that when you said,
Well, you
okay,
got
your
2
turn,
rocks
Bruce.
out of the
I'm sorry.
driveway.
I'm sorry I took some time there. All right.
Well, we all had chores. My dad could have had the milk delivered to the house, but he decided that I needed a little exercise after school, so I had to walk and get the milk, probably 2 or 3 blocks, not very far, but we got a quart and a pint of milk every day. And I never understood why my sister wouldn't have done that better. And then splitting wood was another thing. Once I got old enough to get an axe and use an axe, and somebody taught me how. My father gave me an axe and then showed me the wood pile. And it was my job to get the wood ready to go in the woodshed for the kitchen range. And that wood had to be cut or chopped
so.
pretty small. Then in the winter, my dad bartered, as I said before, and we got maple syrup in the spring. We got logs brought into the mill in the winter. We got wood brought into the backyard that he sold and used at home and in the store. But in the winter, one of the other chores was making the crates to ship the maple syrup in. And that had to be made out of, they sawed thin lumber at the mill, 1/2 inch thick, and we made those crates. So we had something going all the time, and I was thinking of one other thing. They bought, my mother and father bought barrels of apples. They'd buy a barrel of McIntosh and a barrel of Snows and a barrel of Greenings, and they kept them in the cellar at the store, and they had to be individually wrapped in a piece of newspaper. And that was an awful chore for a kid to be in the cellar wrapping apples and putting them back in a barrel. And my father would come down and talk to me and tell me that story about how one rotten apple spoils the barrel. So we all had chores to do. And I think we had a lot of fun doing it, really.
That's a great experience. Ken?
Well, I had chores. We had a large lawn, and my grandmother had even a larger one. And if I was caught up with the lawn mowing at home, I could go down to my grandmother's and pull weeds in the flower bed. Although she had somebody to do that, I was often asked to go down and help. But when we weren't doing chores to alleviate boredom, Treasure Island was just a little ways across the water there, and we had a rowboat. And we'd get 3 or 4 kids from school, and we'd get that boat. And we weren't going to get any chores if we disappeared, and we'd get the boat, and we'd row over on that island. And we built forts out of crates, and then we'd stay over there. We had to take a tent over there, and I mean, we'd spend whole weekends over there. You know, we'd grab a can of soup for each one,
Great
bring a can
location,
from
wasn't
home,
it?
we'd
Yeah.
go over and have something to eat, and we had wonderful times just amusing ourselves. There was no television and no portable radios. You had to listen to the radio in the living room or nowhere, so, but we didn't need it. And camps and shacks, we call them, were a mainstay. There were shacks up the river. There were swimming holes all up the river where the good sandy spots
Great.
were.
Great locations.
That's
right?
how we amused ourselves.
Yes. Fern? What games did you play when you were young? Talking about hopscotch, you want to start with that, or do you want to start with?
Well, I'm afraid
another
we
one?
didn't have any place to play.
Didn't have a place to
hopscotch.
play it, it's like roller skating,
My
you gotta have
best-
something to roller skate on, right?
My best thing, I guess, when I was young, was going up in, Claudia has a sort of a little getaway place, and it's the same place that my brothers and sister and I used to go up with picnic. up in the back lot towards the woods, and there were springs up there that the cows watered at, and we kept dugouts so that they had good fresh water, and a stream you could cool your feet at. The only other thing was that I love to climb trees, and I was always trying to build a tree house. And I'd get one pretty well along, and then a whole bunch of chores would come along, and next thing I knew,
Couldn't finish it.
my tree house never really got finished the way I wanted it to be. I was thinking when I was listening to Bruce and Ken, there's things that I did when I was young that no kids now, unless they buy one of these fancy little dryers that set on your table. But my Aunt Lucy and Uncle Frank Fairbanks had the big dryer that they dried corn and all of that in, and you had to keep the fire going just right under that. And you went down, you pulled these big trays out, and you turned things so that they dried evenly. And that was always a big deal for me to help Aunt Lucy do that. 'Cause Uncle Frank had had a stroke and wasn't able to do a lot of that sort of thing, so she and I did it. And then as a kid, I rode bobs up in and emptied the sap out of the pails on the tree into the big vats, and we brought it down to the big sap house that Grandpa had and poured the sap into the big trays, and then you stirred very carefully, and when it got to be just right, you found the cleanest patch of snow, and you poured a little over that, and nothing was ever as sweet as
right,
that was.
that's
You
really
call
true.
that jackwax.
Yes. But it's just, there's things like that that,
Yeah.
I don't know, the
That's-
kids are missing out today, and they're bored, and I don't blame them. I'd probably be bored too if
Sure.
I'd had the things
Give
for
'em to you,
myself.
yeah.
Yes, no. I wish they could experience some of
Yes,
the things
yes.
that,
Well, that's one of the purposes, I think, of having a sharing of memories like this, really, is because kids are really would like to know. And somehow, in our wonderful modern education, we haven't quite got across to them. And I think things like this, sharing, so they used to do these things, kids, you'd be surprised what they listen to. And so it's your turn now. You can tell us
Well-
about jackwax.
Yeah, well, that was a big thing. I think, though, you're asking about games, and I was thinking when you asked that we used to play, get a ball and find somebody's house that they didn't mind if we threw the ball over the roof. We played
Ellie.
alley
Alley
over.
alley over, yeah, and that was a big, that was a lot of fun, took up a lot of time.
All the district schools did that, didn't they, most of them?
Yes.
Yeah,
And then we made a lot of our own items to play with. I recall one, we had a shingle and we made darts. And we had a throwing stick, and we would throw those as far as we could. And you could throw one maybe a half a city block if you were good, and you could put it in the air a long way. And then you made kites. And we had contests. All these were contests. You had to see who was the best and who could make the best items. In the winter, we made our own bobsleds. And we flooded the hills and streets, actually, but it didn't matter. There were no cars around. And that was who could go the furthest. So I think a lot of those toys, and just talking about bobsleds, I made my nephew, who is just a year younger than I am, I made my nephew a bobsled one time, and did a nice job on it. I painted it, and I painted his name on it, and I called it Ted's Flyer. Well, a year ago, I was in the village he was brought up in, and that was in an antique shop.
Oh, that's a good one.
How does that make you feel?
How
Quite
about,
pleased, quite pleased.
Yes.
what did you play, what did you do, Ken?
We used to play, of course, hide and seek, That was
Yeah.
always great at
Oh,
night.
yeah, that was great.
And, but marbles, I love to play marbles.
Oh, yeah, springtime, you
We
always
would-
know it's springtime with
We'd
it.
play marbles to and from school as we walked along the shoulder of the dirt
You have
road.
shooters? Did you
Oh,
play?
yeah, we had the big shooters.
Steelies? They
If we
were
could
worth-
get
What
them.
were they worth? One, the
Big
big
ball
bug,
bearing.
yeah. They were, a big one was worth, 2 agates, oh,
But you
yeah, I
could- you could,
remember.
you
Okay,
could-
go ahead, I'm sorry to steal your
You
stuff
had, if
here,
you had
yeah.
a steely, it was murder
Oh,
because
yeah,
they'd split your
they
marbles.
go right through the
you know.
snow.
Well, they'd ruin your marble.
Oh, sure, they
They'd
crack
break
a
yours.
glass, yeah.
And, but how we hated those clay marbles. If
Oh.
anybody came playing with those
Yeah,
clay
we call them
marbles.
Biggles, yeah.
Yeah, if you
the
could
clay
hit,
ones,
if
yeah.
you hit the other guy's marble, you kept it.
Yeah.
It wasn't where you
That's
set up
all.
a circle of
No,
marbles.
no, you kept
We'd
it.
just
That-
walk along and
Yeah.
throw one, the next guy would throw, and if he
We
hit your marble, he
Just have
took
a
it.
little bag to keep them in,
Oh,
hanging
yeah.
on your belt. Yeah,
Somebody'd
yeah.
pay you off by
Yeah,
giving you a
right.
clay marble. That was bad. That was a bad
Yeah.
deal.
Well, I have to tell you where I was yesterday. We're just down to Carousel Center, and we took a ride on the new train they have down there. Fantastic. I never thought it would happen, and it would just, it's a self-propelled train, and it's just like the old trolleys that were done 50 years ago. It went just like, hadn't it changed a bit. What a thrill. You go right down the center of Syracuse, stops right at Clinton Station, goes right up, and you go right up the hill to the Dome. It's almost practically right up Rainer Avenue there. Fantastic. And we went down and came back again, $4 for the wife and myself. And it was a real thrill yesterday to tell you about that. What I was really going to ask you about, do you remember the steam trains? You've all ridden on a steam train, I'm sure. Steam locomotive pulling a train. And while you're thinking, I'll tell you one thing. When I went to a National Guard camp down at Peekskill, and I was in Oneonta, and we stayed up all night, and then we slept on the train going down. But you never left the windows open. It was so hot you had to open the windows, you know, and when you got out of there, all the cinders had blown back in the window. That's my contribution to trains. Your turn.
Well, I could tell you that the first train ride I ever had, I don't remember. I was 3 months old. It was February of 1931. My mother had gone west with some girlfriends, found herself, as my birth certificate says, a buckaroo to marry, and a year later I came along, and her folks lived at Mount Pleasant and wanted to see her and their grandchild and their new son-in-law, so they sent money for Mom and Dad to come. And my first train ride was in a wicker basket all the way from Burns, Oregon
Yeah.
to Syracuse, where they met the train. The only other train ride I ever took was after I graduated from high school, and Pat Scott again had gone to Fredonia to high school, and I was working in the Sealwright office, a teletype operator, and she asked me to come down for the homecoming weekend, and so I got on the train with my heart beating very loudly. I was sure everybody in the whole car could hear it. I'd never done anything all by myself before, and to go there and wondered, if everything was going to work the way they promised me it would. And so I went down to Fredonia and back on the train. Those were my 2 train rides.
Great experience. Bruce?
Yeah, I was brought up, that was our conveyance out of the village, all through the winter anyway, and through the summer if you were going to the city. But we rode the train a lot. In my office, I have a picture of my 2 cousins and myself. It was early in the morning, I know. We'd gotten up early and caught some bass. And we had the bass, we're holding them, and the next place we would hold them is up in front of the tracks. We'd go up to the tracks when the train had come through, hold up the fish, and they'd stop and pick us up and give us a ride into the village as long as we gave them the fish. So the conductor was, the brakeman was Pete Moore. Pete used to clean the fish, and they'd cook them in the caboose. And they would eat them, and I forget the engineer's name. And then we rode that train a lot between the villages and into Brockville. Once in a while, we would go from Brockville and catch the train into Montreal to watch a hockey game and come back the following morning, early in the morning. Then there was a jitney, we called it, that rode on those tracks. It was a diesel-electric passenger freight car, and that was a lot of fun to ride in. So we would ride in that. So, and I think one other experience, we swiped the pump car once in a while, that car that you did this, and we'd run up and down the tracks and that until we get caught.
I always remember that on the Tudorville trolley, they always show them racing on, is that what you call it, a pump car?
It's a pump car,
Okay,
yes.
got it.
Well, I had a lot of great training experiences. I had illness as a child, and so they decided that when I recovered, I was only 5, they would send me to a camp in the Adirondacks for the summer, and that's where I learned how to swim and so forth. And to get to that camp, we had to take the train. It was up above Old Forge. But we would catch the train in Syracuse, ride it down to Fonda, usually the milk train, stop at every stop all the way down. Then at Fonda, it would turn off and take the railroad north up through the Adirondacks, and we get off at Carter Station. And I rode that alone at the age of 5, and for several years after that. And they used to have a vendor who would come through the car with a big tray over his arm, and he'd sell ready-made sandwiches and candy and books, comic books, things like this. If you had any money with you, you could spend it on these things. And I got to know that fella. He was always a vendor from Syracuse, evidently rode to Fonda, and then he'd turn around and come back. And in later years, he used to sell newspapers down on Salina Street. And I can remember the same fella and these little wind-up toys that ran around. But then, as I said, I went to Florida on the Seaboard line with the silver cars, the Silver Meteor it was. The cars all stainless steel in 1942. And I used to visit down in New York. My cousin lived on Long Island, and they let me get down alone on the train. You get you on the train, you're safe, you know. I mean, you could just ride down the Hudson River on those big Hudson, New York Central trains, go down through Sing Sing and go by the prison down along the
20th Century Limited.
Yeah, and then I rode, when I was in the service, I got the joy of riding the troop train all the way through Nickel Plate Road and all the way out to the Colorados.
Yeah, I like the way you say the thrill.
Yeah, crossing I mean, I studied the Mississippi and everything, and then I saw it.
I want to thank each one of you for coming out tonight, and possibly we can get together again, and I'll be in touch with you. I've enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure the people who listen will enjoy it also. Terry, that's it. It's a wrap.